Sports Challenge 2020.
A Fisherman's Tale. My initial reaction is of a well-timed shot as the fisherman reaches out to take hold of his catch. The image is well exposed and there is good focus on the fisherman's face and hand. There were two main features which for me distracted from the image. First of all, the glare on the water, which perhaps could have been helped by using a polarizing filter. The metadata suggests that it would have been possible to use a polarizer and still have enough shutter speed for hand holding if the ISO had been increased slightly. The second issue for me is the fish itself. It is obviously very blurred, and I think this is because it is still fighting for its life rather than a focusing issue. Whilst some movement would have given this message and added to the story, I think it is just a bit too blurry and draws the eye away from the main image. A good, timely capture which tells a good story, but with a couple of issues to think about for the next boat trip. Ashes 6. My initial impression is of an interesting action shot of what is obviously an important cricket match, in that there is, perhaps unusually for cricket, a large crowd. I like the composition and the presentation in a letterbox style which I think suits the image. The image is acceptably sharp and the two main characters are well shown with a puff of dust generated by the bowler and the batsman moving into position. I think it might have been slightly improved by a shallower depth of field. I noticed that it was shot at f9, and if it had been slightly wider open it may have defocused the background a little, because with so many in the colours in the crowd I found this just a little bit distracting. In processing, I wonder if it would have been benefited by increasing the exposure, as I found the image to be slightly on the dark side and the histogram is bunched toward the left side. Overall, a good sports photograph showing action which has been captured at just the right moment. Battling the Weir. My initial reaction was of a well-timed capture of an action sports event. The image is well exposed and the focus is spot on, being very sharp on the kayak and the partially submerged figure. The exposure has been handled well, with none of the areas of water being blown out. There are some great triangles formed by the canoeist and his paddle, as well as the paddle and the kayak. There is also adequate space all around the main subjects. Perhaps my only and minor criticism is that the face is covered by the splashing water. I guess this was probably shot on continuous, and I wonder if there's another frame where the face is more visible. A really good sport photograph, which would have been excellent, but just falls short a tad by the partially obscured face, although obviously I understand the inevitable reasons for this. Federer, the maestro. My initial reaction was of a good action shot. Federer has been caught in mid-air, the ball is clearly visible, and there is obvious action in the tennis racket. The image has been well exposed, but I am not sure about the focusing. I think the main focus is appropriately on his face, but his feet and his non-racket hand are slightly blurred. I have no experience of tennis photography, but I would have thought that the shutter speed at 1/800th of a second would have been enough to freeze the movement of his body, and therefore the blurring is probably not due to movement. There does, however, appear to be a lot of blur around the racket, which is probably related to the shutter speed. Unfortunately, the racket itself has become a little obscured as it blends into the background and the photographer's blue jacket. The image may have been enhanced by a faster shutter speed and also a slightly greater depth of field to make sure that Federer was fully sharp. Fishing, a relaxing sport. First impression is of a well exposed and tranquil scene, so a good choice of title. I enjoyed the way that the photo tells the story of the angler and shows the scene in which he is fishing, with the water of the canal leading to the bridge and trees and the hills in the background. I was disappointed that there was, however, no interaction with the angler, whose face cannot really be seen, and also that it is difficult to see exactly where the fishing line goes as it gets lost just before it hits the water. I also feel it would have helped if there had been some separation between his head and the trees above, which might have been possible by moving slightly to one side or adjusting the height of your camera. I appreciate that you couldn't have asked him to take his high-vis jacket off, but think it detracts from the photo. You have found a great spot for an angling photo, which would be well worth another visit. Flat out at Spa. My initial reaction is of a well executed panning photograph. The car itself is really well captured, with some evidence of movement in the tyres, while at the same time the body of the car and the advertising is pin sharp. I noticed the shutter speed of 1/200th of a second, which apparently is just about spot on for this type of photograph. While the colour of the car is striking, I do feel that there is a bit of a clash with the yellow, reds and greens surrounding it. I also found these strong lines running horizontally across the image to be distracting, although unfortunately there is nothing that the author could have done about this. Overall, I think this is a very good panning shot, which has been technically very well executed. Full tilt. My initial impression is of a good action photograph. It looks as if it was a bright day, but you have handled the exposure well. I'm glad you have ignored the rules of thirds, as a more central position for the boy and the football works. I love the concentration on his face with his tongue just protruding. I think also the vignette helps to focus the eye on the story. As a Toffee supporter, I am also glad that you chose to photograph a young boy wearing Everton shorts. I could not find any metadata, so I'm not sure what focal length and aperture was used. I would imagine it was fairly wide open, as the background is nicely blurred and non-distracting, but as a result, although the boy and his face are very sharp, his boot and the football are slightly out of focus. I think this photo demonstrates that you don't need a well-known sports star to produce an interesting sport photograph. Leading trio. Another good action shot with good exposure and composition. Not only the riders, but also the photo are well balanced, with the curved lines on the track positioned symmetrically in the photo. It is good that the face of the first rider can be clearly seen, and he certainly seems to be working hard. I think you've positioned them well in the frame, with enough space to move into, but not too tight behind the third cyclist. My only minor adverse comment is that I found the marks on the track alongside the cyclist a little distracting, and it would have been easy to remove them, turning this from a good to an excellent sports action shot. Incidentally, I note that it was shot at an ISO of 10,000. Amazing technology to be able to use such a high ISO, which would have been inconceivable just a few years ago. No limits. My apologies to the photographer, but as soon as I opened this image, I knew it was not for me. This is not a comment about any technical issues, but just that this type of presentation does not work for me personally. It just shows how much personal likes and dislikes impact on appraisals and photo competitions. I'm not sure I would call this a sport photograph, but more a product photograph, as there is no activity or action. I'm not sure the car is totally sharp, and if the image is being presented in this format, then I think the car needs to be sharp right through. I'm also struggling to see if there is a driver, which adds to the static nature of the shot. I cannot tell if it was captured in motion or if it was stationary at the time of taking. Again, apologies, but it's just not for me, although somebody else would almost certainly have given a totally different view. Opposite lock. My initial impression was of a sports action shot which had captured an interesting moment in this car race. It is well exposed and the car is sharp. It is also possible to see the driver and that he appears to be wrestling to control the car. My main criticism was that it all appears to be a little remote and that I am looking in rather than an active viewer. I wonder if it would benefit from a small crop, and this would also help to take the eye away from the hedge and the pole with the yellow sign in the background. Two other possibilities in processing. I think it might benefit from lifting the overall exposure a little, probably just a third of a stop. And secondly, a vignette may draw the eye more into the action. Overall, I think this is a good shot, well captured, but perhaps would benefit from just a little bit of tweaking. Race to the finish. My initial reaction was of an image which was quite difficult to look at. It is certainly very colourful with the various sails, and these are the main point of the photo and are in focus. I like the sweep of the shoreline, and the spectator is in a good position watching the event. I also like the presentation in a letterbox style which works for the number of yachts. The main problem for me is the glare coming off the water. My eye is drawn particularly to the area adjacent to the shoreline. Perhaps a polarizing filter would have helped, and I noticed that the shutter speed is 1/1600th of a second, so even with the reduced shutter speed that a polarizer would have caused, it would have still been possible to have handheld and be sharp. A good colourful action shot, but for me the glare is a distraction. Also not sure about the title, as no suggestion of a finishing line in the picture. Whose idea was this? Excuse the pun, but a nicely balanced shot. This has been well exposed in what appears to be strong light. I particularly like the side light catching the side of their faces, which can be clearly seen, although neither of them looks particularly thrilled by their experience, of course making the title, Whose Idea Was This?, very appropriate. Although shooting at f6.3 has helped to blur the background, which is good, I think it has also resulted in the cyclist and the bike not being sharp right through. My main criticisms would be, firstly, that the image is very static. It looks as if they are just sitting on a stationary bike. Perhaps a panning shot would have helped. Secondly, it would have been better if it had been possible to see all of the wheels, which may have been achievable with a change of your position.